let's talk first about Sarah Albee. Did you know that more than 50 million American households own at least one pet dog? Did you know that George Washington was a dog lover and actually had a dog named Sweet Lips? Even more interesting, in fact, I read in Sarah's book that after suffering a loss at a battle in Germantown, Pennsylvania, they found a confused little dog walking around. As it turns out, this dog belonged to the British commander, General William Howe. So Washington, being the gentleman that he was, actually through a messenger, sent the dog back to the British commander, who was very grateful and happy to see his dog. Did you know that Napoleon Bonaparte hated dogs? Yet, despite his dislike of him, he found himself signing off on one of his famous love letters to his beloved Josephine, millions of kisses, some even for Fortune, I'm guessing? French? I don't speak French. In spite of his naughtiness. Fortune was Josephine's dog. And finally, did you know that the top 5 dog names are Bella, Lucy, Max, Daisy, and Bailey? If you are like me and love history and interesting facts, but love dogs even more, don't wait another minute before purchasing the book, Dog Days of History by Sarah Albee. I am definitely not alone in my praise for this book. Reviews are overwhelmingly positive. One reader wrote, "Dogs, history, and Sarah Albee, these are a few of my favorite things." Another reader wrote, "There's so much to look at and to read in this book. I'm sure you could read this book over and over again and still learn something new. My kids loved this book." Dog Days of History is a fascinating combination of interesting history lessons and the importance of dogs throughout time. I honestly could not put the book down and read it all in one sitting. Sarah includes information that you most likely will never learn in a classroom, and it is very reader-friendly. It enhanced my love of history and provided me with a much deeper understanding of the role dogs have played and still do play in our lives. Sarah Albee, of course, is a dog lover herself. Her relationship with dogs began at a young age with her 3-legged dog, Albee. Albee went on to have puppies, which added 2 more dogs to Sarah's family. In addition to her dogs, she grew up with many other animals and learned so many life lessons from them, especially what love looks like. Sarah is the New York Times best-selling author of more than 100 books for children, ranging in ages preschool through middle school. However, I feel that her books extend to all ages. Prior to becoming a writer, Sarah worked at Children's Television Workshop, played basketball in college, even playing a year of semi-professional women's basketball in Cairo, Egypt. She currently lives in Connecticut with her husband, who is, no surprise, a high school history teacher, and has 3 children and, of course, a dog named Rosie. We are so lucky to have Sarah here with us today and hope she talks about her book, Dog Days of History, but also, hopefully, she might mention a little bit about her upcoming book, Alexander Hamilton, A Plan for America. We're going to see Hamilton this summer, due to the release coming in July. Please join me first in welcoming the very talented Sarah Albee. Oh, you want me to? I can introduce both of you. Oh, okay, all right, great.
Can I take this out of here? Yes. Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for crossing the Okefenokee Swamp to be here. Really appreciate your showing up, and it's late in the day. I am going to talk about my Dog Days book. Now, because dogs can't read and write, and they can't write biographies, this is a very visual book. There's a lot of images, and so I have a lot of slides, not a lot, but some slides to show you as sort of to take you through the history of the human-dog relationship from ancient times to the present. But you now know a little bit about my childhood dog. This is Albee. I'm the youngest of 4. I'm the cute one, second from the left. And that's my dog. And yes, as we just heard, she did have 3 legs. She was struck by a car when she was a puppy, but she lived to a ripe old age. She had 7 puppies of her own. That's actually my sister, because by the time you're the 4th kid, your parents don't take pictures of you. So parents, if you have multiple children, please take pictures of them, because none exist of just me. I'm not upset or bitter at all, but that is my older sister. Here's Abby later. She, as I say, she did live quite a long, healthy, happy life. She could beat me in a foot race even though she only had 3 legs. That's her son, Otis, and that's my sister, the one who is in the picture. So the history of dogs goes way back to the cave people days, but here are just a few ancient societies that loved and worshipped dogs. The ancient Egyptians loved dogs so much that when a beloved family dog died, oftentimes members of the family would shave their eyebrows in mourning. That is a Roman dog. My pointer doesn't work. Oh, well, that's a Roman dog, beautiful greyhound. So the ancient Romans also loved their dogs. You can see in the ruins of Pompeii, which is a town that got destroyed by a volcano, you can see Cave Canem, which means beware of dog in Latin. Now, the Middle Ages, that looks like a bunny rabbit. It might be a bunny rabbit now that I look at this picture. But Middle Ages, dogs were kind of exclusively for the wealthy, dogs as pets. And it's an interesting thing that dogs as pets it really wasn't until the 20th century that ordinary middle-class people were able to afford a dog as a pet. Up until then, pets were for the wealthy. So lap dogs and hunting dogs, those were high-end dogs. Those are expensive. Ordinary working people did have dogs, but they had to work for a living just as their owners did. And I'll show you a little bit about that. This is King of England. I can't remember who that is. It might be Louis XIV. I don't know who this was. But anyway, this is a king of somewhere. And I show this because oftentimes rulers, in the times before modern medicine, many rulers, because there were so many contagious diseases, many future child kings and queens were really not allowed to play with children because they were afraid they'd catch diseases. So oftentimes a dog was their closest companion. So it's fascinating and sort of sad that a lot of rulers, they're in my book, if they had to go to the execution block or if they were deposed or whatever, they would bring their dogs with them as companions. They were their most beloved companions. Now, in medieval times, we have dogs galore. They would be, forks were not widely used until the 1600s. So before then, yes, they did have spoons and they did have knives, but oftentimes most of the time, people ate with their fingers. Even fancy people ate with their fingers. So dogs were excellent table napkins. They were also used as poison tasters sometimes. They were also used, small dogs especially could be used as lap warmers, foot warmers. The Puritans would bring their dogs to church with them, or they didn't call it church, they called it a meeting house. But their services would last all day long in these really cold meeting houses. So dogs were excellent foot warmers. In Asia, they had what were called sleeve dogs because sometimes and again, these are for the royal people, the nobility. And these small dogs were called sleeve dogs because they could fit inside your sleeves and keep your hands warm. Now, I just like to show these guys because they're funny. This is the Renaissance, and there was a fashion in the Renaissance for men especially to be shown with a noble dog and the hand on the dog to show this faithful creature looking up. They wanted to kind of keep the social hierarchy, and so know that these are all like dukes of wherever, and they're their hands on dogs to show that they're they have underlings and faithful people who know their place. If you're wondering what the guy on the right is wearing, I urge you to check out my other book, which is called Why'd They Wear That? And it's the history of crazy fashions and why people wore what they wore. But honestly, that's called a codpiece, and it has a really funny history, but we won't go into that right now. Okay, moving along to the next slide. Oh, in the 1700s, certain dogs became so prized that they were just the only subject of portraits. They were no longer just painted with their owner to show how powerful the owner was. People were so into their dogs, they just had, their portraits, their dog portraits painted. Then we get into the 1700s. Now, most men prior to the 1700s, a sword was kind of fashionable for gentlemen. But by the 1700s, swords have kind of gone by the wayside. And walking sticks, well, that's the 1600s, but I just love his outfit so much I had to show him. But walking sticks came into vogue. Now, as you can see, these walking sticks, that's not going to help you if you have a sprained ankle or something, right? And it was kind of a fashion statement, but this is before the rabies vaccine. And in many major urban centers, there were packs of roving dogs in most cities. And so a walking stick was extremely handy for whacking away a lunging dog that might give you rabies. Fun fact. And it wasn't until Louis Pasteur in 1885 developed a vaccine for rabies that people stopped. Well, they still feared rabies, but it was less of an issue. That's the boy that he saved who had been bitten by a mad dog, and he saved him he hadn't tried this out on a human before, but he knew the boy was in for it if he didn't try it, so he did, and it worked. The boy lived to a nice old age. So dogs, as I said, dogs had to work for a living. Because most people had to work for a living, most of their dogs did too. So dogs did all kinds of stuff. They pulled carts. They turned spits. Can you see up in there? That's like a hamster wheel up there. There's a turn spit dog, and it's turning this wheel, which is attached to pulleys, which is turning the spit and roasting the meat in front of the fire. So these turn spit dogs, they had these low-to-the-ground dogs with short legs and really muscular. This was their job. Not fun. In the 1800s, dogs were used to power machinery before mechanization. So the dog in the upper left is a dog-powered sewing machine. The one on the upper right is a dog-powered, I think he's milling grain. And the dog, that's like a tricycle-type contraption, and there's a dog on either side, so they're powering that bicycle thing-ish. This is me walking my dog on the left. Not really. Dogs in the 1800s, this is when kind of the snobbery and the classism of it was not a tolerant century pretty much anywhere, but people got really into dog breeds, and they started breeding, and purebred dogs became very high status symbols, especially for middle class people who were sort of getting more and more wealth and expendable income. Then dog shows, first in England and then in America, those became a really big deal. In the 20th century, dogs were used in advertising. That is a very iconic image of the RCA dog that was painted by a guy who sold it to the RCA company, and it became a super duper famous logo. Dogs, and I talk about dogs in polar regions in the book. Dogs have basically come with us to every climate on Earth. They can survive in the desert, they can survive in polar regions, they can survive everywhere in between. They're quite remarkable. Dogs have come to war with us since ancient times. The ancient Romans brought them, but even farther back, the Hittites and the Assyrians, and they used these giant Molossian dogs that were really not somebody you wanted to meet in a dark alley. But this is a dog in World War I, and it's a messenger dog. You can see the soldier is putting a message into the canister on its collar, and it would zoom through enemy lines to deliver memos and things like that. Dogs were used as propaganda. This is World War I. It was when Germany was at war with, in this case, England. We were obviously in it too, but the British bulldog was a symbol of Britain, and the dachshund was a symbol of Germany. Now, dachshunds fell out of favor during World War I because they were considered German, and Germany was the enemy, so they were called Liberty dogs for a while there, along with a lot of other foods and things like that. And there we go. Oh, and as you said in my intro, yeah, I did grow up on a farm. I was really fortunate to be around animals, and I think that's something that's kind of missing nowadays. I think for a lot of kids, how many of you kids have a dog? Or how many of anyone have a dog? A lot of you. Anyone have any other kinds of pets? Okay, so that sort of shows you that sometimes a dog or a cat or maybe a goldfish or a guinea pig is really the only member of the natural kingdom that kids get to know. In the old days, people lived on farms and they would have domesticated animals, but they might see a fox in the hen house or a snake in the outhouse or something. But even in cities, there were animals. There were, people would drive cattle through the streets, and there would be, of course, horses, and many times there were pigs that were acting as sort of the garbage collectors in a lot of cities. So we don't see animals as much as we used to, and it's a little sad, but dogs really have kind of remained that bridge between the human world and the animal world. All right, time to play a game. There's a part of my book where I talk about the theory that, have you ever heard this theory that owners look like their dogs? Some of you? Okay, so I'm going to show you. Now, some of you, this might be simpler for. Kindergarten, I can stump pretty easily, but we'll see. So I have an owner, and I'm going to show you dog 1, dog 2, dog 3. And I want you to tell me who is the dog, who is her dog. So there's the owner. Don't shout it out. I'll give you a show of hands. Okay, here's dog 1. Here's dog 2. Here's dog 3. Who thinks it's dog number 1? Raise your hand. Be brave. Who thinks it's dog number 2? Okay, this is not going to go well. Who thinks it's dog number 3? Okay, you're right. They do look alike, don't they? All right, ready? Here's another one. Here's the owner. And here's dog number 1. And dog number 2. And dog number 3. Who thinks it's dog number 1? Who thinks it's dog number 2? Who thinks it's dog number 3? You were right. It's dog number 2. All right. And I'm going to go quickly because I don't want to run out of time. Okay, here's the last one. Here's the owner. Dog number 1. Dog number 2. Dog number 3. All right. I'm not going to ask her a show of hands. All right. One more. Ready? I'll show you the dog, and I want you to tell me who the owner is. Ready? Here's the owner. Here's the dog. Here's owner number 1. Owner number 2. And owner number 3. Yes, people, that is my dog. That is my dog, Rosie. So I will skip over a couple of slides because I don't want to run into Dr. Bennett's time, but that is my dog, Rosie. She's the one second from the left. Those are some of our friends who are pretending to be dogs, but I will go quickly. So there you go, and thank you, and I will turn it over to my lovely co-presenter. Oh, you have to be introduced. You deserve an introduction.
Okay, so now let's talk about Dr. Howard Bennett. The fantastic body, what makes you tick and how you get sick, is a terrifically fascinating, hysterically funny mix of humor and science. It is the ultimate kids' reference book to the human body. I read this book in one day. Yes, it's pretty big, and I've already begun rereading it. It's that good. Dr. Bennett has authored a book that is a gift not only to parents and children, but to all teachers who teach their students about text features. The book is beautifully organized into various categories, some of them being Yuck Alert, Ooh, It's True, Tips, Fact or Fib, Vocab Lab, and my personal favorite, What the Heck, and True Tales and Try This. His chapter titles and headings are catchy and really grab the reader's attention as well. My personal favorite, was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Snot. Dr. Bennett does an excellent job explaining the what, where, how, and why of the secret world of your body, and does it in a way that's informative, interesting, engaging, and absolutely hilarious. Some examples from his work include, did you know that there was an actual condition called, and I probably will mispronounce this, rhinotelexomania? Okay. Or what we would commonly call excessive nose picking. Did you know that going outside with wet hair will not cause a cold, despite what our mothers told us? And did you know that some African tribes actually use soldier ants to repair cuts? Not only can you read about it in his book, but you can actually see a photograph of it. The fantastic body is also full of colorful diagrams, amazing drawings, and photographs. My favorite photograph in the book was a series of pictures of moles that would appear on people's bodies, and with the fourth and final one being an actual garden mole. That's a good example of Dr. Bennett's humor. The Fantastic Body is very reader-friendly and presents complex information in a way that's very easy to understand. I found myself reciting facts such as O-negative blood is used for emergency transfusions because it contains no markers and will not be a mismatch with the person getting the blood. I happen to be O-negative blood, so I found that very interesting. Or that there's no such thing as double jointed, but rather a person may have greater range of motion in their joints. Or that I can describe what it looks like when a dust mite actually is eating a skin flake. How many people can actually say that? Well, if you read his book, you can say that as well. I've never met Dr. Bennett, but after reading his book, I feel as if I have known him for a very long time. His voice comes through loud and clear in the book and makes me wish I had him as a pediatrician when I was little. He clearly loves being a doctor and says that it is because he can work with kids and keep them healthy. He also loves to play detective, trying to figure out what is wrong with his patients and how to make them better. He states, despite patients drooling, peeing, and coughing on him, being a pediatrician is the coolest job in the world. And it must be since he has been in practice for over 35 years of experience. Dr. Bennett also has contributed to medical advice columns, wrote for the Kids Post section of the Washington Post for 9 years, provided online pediatric content for GreatDad.com, and has his own website. The Fantastic Body is his 9th book, and we are so happy to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming the very astute and witty Dr. Howard Bennett.
Thank you. It's going to be hard to compete with that. I don't have slides, but I do have some visual aids. And I'll try and describe this stuff. I'm not going to sort of go through the book, just talk a little bit about the human body. Obviously, it's something I love. I even buy my shirts to reflect this interest. The book grew out of this column that I wrote in the Post for 9 or 10 years, which was all about, it was called Ever Wondered, and a lot of the entries that I had done were about body issues, health issues, a lot of dog stuff, too, like why dogs smell each other's butts, things like that. And since I'm on that subject, that's a good question. Dogs are much better. In the roof of our mouth, we have cells that help with smell. It goes up into our brain. It's called the olfactory center. And we have about 60 million, something like that, cells that are devoted to this. Dogs have about 250 million cells devoted to this. That's why dogs are better finding us when we're lost than us finding them. And I do have 2 dogs. So if Mojo's in the living room, Lexi walks in, they smell each other's butts, so they know who they are. Then one of them leaves and comes back 30 seconds later and they sniff again. It's just because they rely on smell. That's the primary way that they like to experience the world. They do have eyes, they can't see, but they do prefer smell. So let's get back to human body. I don't know why the butt. We have cats too, and our cats go face to face. They smell each other's face. I don't know. Maybe Sarah can answer this later. Anal glands, there we go. Okay, so the human body is awesome. We're composed of trillions of cells. Cells are these little tiny things that work together in our body to help us do the things that we do. Some of our cells are nerve cells. There's about 85 billion of them. And nerve cells, can anybody guess what they help us do? They help us think. They're also important for movement. When I go like this with my left hand, this part of my brain is actually sending a signal across, telling me to move my hand. The brain is also responsible for things in controlling our muscles that we don't think about, like digestion, whether your pupils get big or small. But primarily, muscles work with movement. Skin cells keep good stuff in and bad stuff out. Mucus cells are my favorite cells, getting into the Harry Potter and the Chamber of Snot. If you had lunch today, which I'm sure everybody did, When you ate your food, it went into your stomach, and your stomach produces acid and chemicals to digest the food that you ate. Why doesn't the stomach digest itself? And the reason for that is there are mucus glands inside the stomach wall, and so there's a coating of thick mucus that keeps the stomach from digesting itself. When children say, that my little brother was, growing in my mother's stomach, that's not really true, or the baby would be digested like a piece of cheese. Babies grow in a mother's uterus where there is no acid. If anybody's had a stomach ache after taking too much Motrin or too much Advil, that's because those drugs reduce the amount of stomach acid that's produced, the amount of stomach mucus that's produced, which allows the acid to hurt the stomach. The other mucus cells we have are in your nose and sinuses, and every day we swallow about 2 cups of snot without thinking about it. But the purpose for this is to trap the dust and the germs and the mold that's floating around in the air, even though we can't see it. So those are some of the cells that we have in the body. Because we don't have that much time today, I want to focus a little bit on the bones and muscles, which is why I have my visual aids here. So if you can see, we have a skeleton, and when you were born, you had about 300 bones in your body, and by the time you're an adult, you only have about 200 bones left, which is kind of interesting. The reason for this, if you just look at a head, my skull or cranium is 1 bone, but when I was a baby, it was made up of multiple bones, so my skull could grow as my brain grew. And then as you get older, bones fuse, and that's how you end up going from 300 to about 200. Muscles are skeletal muscles, and this is a model of that. I can pick this one up. We have about 600 of these. The skeletal muscles are the ones that allow us to move. We also have something called cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, what does that do? Anybody say? Heart. And then we have something else called smooth muscle, which is a muscle, just like our heart muscle, we don't control. That's what helps food go through your intestinal tract, etc. All right, so back to bones. Our skeleton does 4 things. 2 of them are pretty obvious. 2 of them are less obvious. We'll go through all 4. So one of the things our skeleton does is it helps us stand and move. So if you go like this and flex your bicep muscle, you have 2 muscles in your upper arm. The bicep muscle is responsible for flexing, and then the muscle in the back is called the triceps, and that's involved with extension. And many of the muscles in our body are involved with flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Does anybody have an idea what the biggest muscle in the body is? I'll give you a hint. It's our butt muscle, otherwise referred to as the gluteus maximus. This is also the strongest muscle we have in terms of brute strength, the amount of force that it can exert. Some people think the heart is stronger because it can beat and beat and beat and beat and beat, and that is true. The heart beats over 100,000 times a day. You could clearly not do that with your hand, but for total force, your butt muscle is the one that does it. So the body helps us move. Of course, it couldn't do that without the brain telling the muscles to move. It also couldn't do it without the brain telling us where we are in space. So if anybody wants to put out your arm, close your eyes, and touch your nose with your finger, the reason you can do that is because there's nerves in your muscles and your joints telling you where you are in space. And the fancy term for that is called proprioception. And if anybody ever is stopped by a police officer when they've had a few too many beers, your proprioception will be tested to see if you should be driving a car or not. Now, who can tell me the biggest the biggest bone in the body? Thigh bone, otherwise called the femur. This is an actual human bone as opposed to the skeletal that I have up here. This is from somebody, an Italian friend of mine went to medical school there, and he got this for me. So this is the biggest bone in the body. The smallest bone in the body is about the size of a grain of rice, and it's inside, behind your eardrum, and it's involved with the vibration that helps sound be transmitted into the brain. So movement is the most common thing, the thing that most people know about that helps that our skeleton is responsible for. The other thing the skeleton does is it protects us. 3 areas in particular. This is a brain, hopefully a little smaller than mine. And this is protected in our skull. We also have a rib cage, which protects our heart and our lungs. In the back, we have our backbone, and traveling down the middle of the backbone is our spinal cord. And so again, when I do this, nerves from my brain go down my spinal cord out to my hand and letting me do this. So the spinal cord is protected by the spine, the heart and the lungs are protected by the rib cage, and the brain is protected by the skull. So that's the second thing, movement protection. Another cool thing that the skeleton does is it makes blood. The middle of the bone here where my hand is, this is called compact bone, and inside that is something called yellow marrow. If you ever get a bone for your dog, and the dog is going wacko with the marrow, it's the yellow marrow that the dog likes to eat. At the end of the bones, it's called spongy bone, and later I can show people what this looks like, but it's kind of honeycombed, and at the end of long bones is where you have bone marrow, and that's what makes most of the blood in our body. If you know anybody who's ever had leukemia and had to get a bone marrow test done, that is done by inserting a big needle into the pelvis area, because the pelvis is also a very big source of blood production. So blood is another thing that our body does, that our skeleton does. And then the last thing is that our skeleton is a bank. Now that's a strange thing. What does a bank do? A real bank. It holds money, you take money out, you put money in, and if you take too much money out, eventually your account is empty. So, raise your hand if your parents bug you to drink milk. Mine did. Here's another fun fact. Drinking milk does not make you taller. It does give you stronger bones, but it does not make you taller. Calcium is the biggest or the most common or most important element in bone, but calcium is important for every single cell in our body. So the cell cannot function, or I should say our cells cannot function without calcium. And you don't eat it every day. So let's say you go a day and you're not eating calcium. Where does the body go to get it? Into the bank. So it goes into the blood. So we have cells that put calcium into bone. We have cells that take calcium out of bone. If you ever break a bone, did anybody ever break a bone? I certainly did. I was playing Wide World of Wrestling when I was 9, jumped on my friend Michael. Actually, I dove on my friend Michael and missed and broke my wrist. When that happens, the body lays down a tremendous amount of new bone around the area where it broke. There's also bleeding and swelling, and it hurts. And the reason you get casted is to keep the broken area, which we call a fracture, stable until the body heals it. If you took a picture of somebody 6 weeks after they had a broken bone, you would see all this stuff like my fist on the outside of the bone. That's the new calcium that was put down in that area to fix the bone. And then if you x-ray that bone another 6 to 9 months later, the bone will look like this again because the body has reabsorbed all the extra calcium. So calcium is going in, calcium is going out all the time. Now, you might sometimes hear with grandparents, or, older people, that they have something called osteoporosis. And this is a condition where their bones have gotten a little bit less dense over time. It's harder to get calcium into the bone when you're elderly. And that's why also older folks are more likely to break a bone if they fall. When little kids break a bone, you often just see a little tiny crack in the outside of the bone. Whereas if somebody my age falls down and I break a bone, it's just going to crack right in half. So the skeleton helps us stand and move. It protects some of our vital organs. It makes red stuff, blood. and it stores calcium. How are we doing for time? Why don't we wrap up, and then if anybody has any questions, we'll take them. Yeah. The question is, why do some people have arthritis? I'll do my best to answer that since it's not typically a pediatric problem. But where your bones meet in your joints, let me turn this guy around. You have well, actually, I'll just do it with this. The femur, hold on. This is a right femur. So it would go into the pelvic area here and come down to the knee. And then the leg bones, the lower leg bones would come down from here. You don't want to have bone sitting on bone because that would hurt. So there's a special type of cartilage. And for the kids here, if you take your nose and go like this is cartilage, this is cartilage. Cartilage is like really soft, we call it connective tissue. And just by the way, sharks don't have any bones in their body. Everything in a shark is cartilage. Anyway, back to this. So you have something called articular cartilage right here, very tough tissue that goes from one bone to the other. You then have ligaments supporting the joints, which is another type of tough tissue, and then tendons attaching over joints because tendons are what attaches muscle to the bone so that you can move. And then there's fluid in there. So when you get arthritis, there's inflammation in the joint. This can be caused by infection. This is one of the things we see with kids. It's called a septic arthritis or a viral arthritis. You can also get it from what's called osteoarthritis, just when you get older because the cartilage wears down. And then rheumatoid arthritis is a condition where your body makes antibodies or chemicals that attacks itself. So it's kind of like a screw up in the immune system. That causes inflammation, swelling, and pain, etc. And it runs in families. So if your parents had it, you're more likely to have it. That's a great question. The question is about muscle memory. The memory's not really in your muscle. The memory is in your brain. And obviously the brain is very complicated. There's an area in the back that's responsible for a lot of the automatic things that we do. And so it's really those patterns that are laid down that enable you to do a layup without thinking about it.
Yeah, the question is, do dogs have emotions? Are we anthropomorphizing our pets, or do they truly get sad when we leave? It's amazing how little we still know about dogs, and they're still coming out with studies. But, you know, I'm a basketball player, and I hear experts talk about basketball and say, oh, there's no such thing as streak shooting. Yes, there is. I mean, it's one of those sort of logical things that if you really know your subject or you know your sport, like, of course dogs have emotions. Anyone who has a dog knows that they do. But in terms of just how much and how human-like they are, that's the stuff that's still being explained and studied. You can ask questions about writing as well, or anything, really. I mean, yes. The question is, how long did it take us to write our books? Do you want to?
The first part is what you write, and then you submit a manuscript, and then it gets edited and blah, blah, blah. The first part took me about 9 to 10 months. And part of that was because I had done a lot of the kids' post articles that had explored some of the same things. So I was able to recycle some of that stuff. It made it a little bit easier. Plus, because this is what I do every day, I didn't have to do as much research as the average person would have had to do.
I would say I have a similar answer. Most of my books take about a year to research, a year to write, and then another year for looking for images and back and forth and going to the printer. It can be 5 years from the time I have an idea to the time I'm holding the book in my hands. But because I write so much history, and a lot of my books are kind of are ancient, are tracing chronological things from ancient times to the present, I kind of have a base of knowledge about history. So, but what I like to do is trace one thing through, like, for example, my poop book is tracing the history of sanitation through from ancient times to the present, because I would argue that the history of sanitation is the history of civilization, because societies that paid attention to what to do with their waste tended not to die. And so that really is human. And then I have how insects changed history, what people wore and why they wore it. My poison book came out this past September. It's how humans have poisoned each other from ancient times to the present. That's more of a whodunit detective-y thing, because poisoners didn't really write memoirs. So, but then neither did dogs. So sometimes it really is, you're trying to triangulate facts and see what you think is true. But in other words, so the short answer is about 5 years. Any other questions? How are we doing on time? Are we done? Are we out of time? 5 minutes. If anyone has other questions, yes. Do you want us both?
I'm one of those people that didn't read as a child. So there's a certain irony to this question. I did supposedly read comic books, but that was about it. I started writing for doctors, articles, serious type things, because I worked at a medical center, and then I started writing humor for doctors. And then I wrote a bedwetting book for kids, and then I realized I wanted to write for kids. And then things just evolved.
And I got my first job, my second job. My first job was, I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I was working for a press office there. Came back, got a job at Sesame Street, and I worked there for 9 years. So that was the best job. You want it to be a fun place to work, and it was the best place ever. So I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't sure. So that's when I knew I wanted to write for kids. And I was there for 9 years. And my first books a lot of them were television-based, SpongeBob and Blue's Clues and like Dora and all that stuff. And it was really when my kids needed me less that I did my true love, which is history, because it takes a lot of research. I kind of live at the library. So that's been in the past 10 years or so. Other questions? Ready to wade back through the swamp? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Still am a doctor. Yeah, I do medical stuff full time. I write at night and on weekends. Yeah. Yes.
We're all going to show them our trick knee after the. The question is, when did the first humans and dogs become companions and then partners, etc.? Again, we don't know. It kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask someone, a geneticist who studies DNA, they'll say 35,000 years ago. If you ask archaeologists who unearth graves and find, humans and dogs with their arms around each other, they'll say 15,000 years ago. So we really aren't sure, because dogs share so much DNA with wolves. In fact, they're the same species technically, that it's hard to tell if it's a wolf or a dog in an archaeological site. But it's probably what happened is that the first young wolf pups came closer to the fire, and they sounded the alarm when an enemy came by, so the people let them stay, and in turn they were fed and given warmth, and then the rest is history. And we have 2 minutes. Any other questions? Well, we'll be here all day if you want to come sign. Thank you again for sticking it out so late in the day. This is really nice to have you all here.